In the summer of 1989, as the Cold War draws to a close, Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska plays host to the world's largest aircraft, the Soviet AN-225. With its enormous wingspan of nearly 300 feet, is a haunting reminder of the past. But ironically, it will be the last of the Russian giants. From the earliest times, Soviet designers had a reputation for producing large aircraft. Before World War II, most Russian giants began life as bombers. Some, like the TB-3 designed by Tupolev, were converted for use as transport aircraft. But not all Soviet transport aircraft of the 1930s were large, nor were they necessarily Soviet designs. The PS-84 was a Soviet version of the American Douglas DC-3 built under license. In 1936, the Russian aircraft engineer Boris Lizunov was sent to America to see the construction of the DC-2 at first hand. Aeroflot had bought one, and Lizunov's visit was intended to give the Russians some technical background. And while he was in America, Lizunov saw the DC-3 and sent enthusiastic reports back to the Soviet Union. As a result, the Soviet government negotiated a license to manufacture a Russian version of the DC-3. Lizunov returned to the Soviet Union to supervise production. At first, the Russian version was called the PS-84. Lizunov modified the design for Soviet conditions and concentrated on making it suitable for cold weather operation. The value of Lizunov's work was recognized by changing the designation of the aircraft from PS-84 to Li-2. The Li-2 was used in the Great Patriotic War as a transport and troop carrier, and it was produced in its thousands. Like its American cousin, the DC-3, it remained in service for many years and was a classic aircraft. The AN-2 was the work of designer Oleg Antonov. In comparison with the Li-2, it looks old, but even though it's a biplane, it's actually a post-war design. It flew for the first time in August 1947. Antonov began his career designing gliders, and the AN-2 was his first powered aircraft. It was an extraordinarily successful debut. Even though the design is almost half a century old, AN-2s are still flying in large numbers. These days, some of them have updated avionics and instrumentation, and they've been adapted for many different purposes. They can carry passengers or cargo and operate in a great variety of climatic conditions. This one is fitted as a parachute trainer. The landing gear of the AN-2 is fixed. It's very strong, capable of landing on the worst unprepared airstrip. The wheels are interchangeable with skis for operation from Russia's winter snow. The AN-2 was produced continuously in the Soviet Union for almost 20 years and was also produced in Poland in great numbers. Originally, it was called the Sielsko-Khazainstvenie 1, meaning General-Purpose Agricultural Aircraft number 1. But when its potential was recognized, it was renamed the AN-2 after Antonov. Antonov himself was awarded a Stalin Prize and 100,000 rubles in 1952. He was on his way to becoming a great designer of Russian giants. The Ilyushin Design Bureau was to become another producer of large Soviet aircraft. Its first transport aircraft was the IL-12, designed in 1944 as a successor to the Soviet DC-3 copy. Ilyushin was famous for the production of the enormously successful Shturmovik ground attack aircraft of the Great Patriotic War. But neither the IL-12 nor its successor, the IL-14, would share the Sturmovik's distinction. Like most Soviet aircraft, the IL-12 and 14 were designed for a combination of civil and military use. The IL-12 went into service with both the Red Air Force and the Soviet airline Aeroflot immediately after the war. As an airliner, the IL-12 had shortcomings. It needed a crew of 5 and could only carry a maximum of 32 passengers. Its fuel consumption was high, and by Western standards, it was not an economic proposition for airline operation. But its prime purpose was military transport, and the design was effective enough to warrant the development of this aircraft, its successor, the IL-14. The IL-14 was given an unfortunate NATO code name. It was called the Crate. For the design bureau that produced the Sturmovik, this was less than flattering. The Crate certainly compared poorly with Western transports of the time, but in 3 post-war decades, Ilyushin would establish a strong reputation as the designer of giant transport aircraft. In the early 50s, the American Lockheed Company produced a design that set a new standard for military transport aircraft. It was the C-130 Hercules. It had 4 powerful turboprop engines and a fat fuselage with the greatest possible internal capacity for its size. It entered service in 1956. The development of Soviet transport aircraft had fallen behind the West. In 1956, the best Soviet transport was the twin-engine Crate. Nikita Khrushchev encouraged the development of new Soviet transports, but it was almost 4 years before Soviet military transport aviation answered the C-130. The new aircraft was from the Antonov Bureau. It had high wings and 4 turboprops. It looked remarkably like the Hercules. The AN-12 was codenamed Cub by NATO. Its configuration, size, and mission all coincided closely with C-130, but in some ways it was cruder. The C-130 was completely pressurized and air-conditioned. The AN-12's cargo hold was not. The original engines of the C-130, at 4,500 horsepower each, were slightly more powerful than those of the AN-12. The wingspan of the Hercules was 132 feet, 8 feet greater than the AN-12. But the AN-12 was about 8 feet longer. The AN-12 was significantly faster than the Hercules, capable of more than 480 miles an hour. But the Hercules had a greater range with its maximum payload. For a transport aircraft, the most important statistic is payload. And here the Hercules was a clear winner. Its maximum takeoff weight of 175,000 pounds was about 40,000 pounds greater than the AN-12. The AN-12 was not a new design. It was a development of the Antonov AN-10A, a commercial transport that had considerable teething troubles. In 1959, design conferences were held to improve its performance and adapt it for military use. The wingspan was reduced to give extra speed, and the fuselage was lengthened to increase cargo and fuel capacity. A defensive gun position was added to the tail, and the large rear door was fitted. The result was the AN-12. It could carry 44,000 pounds of useful load, or 80 to 100 fully armed troops. It could operate from poor airfields, and it could be fitted with skis for use in snow. At last, the post-war Soviet Union had a competitive transport aircraft. The AN-12 came just at the right time. In the early 60s, a new doctrine of air mobility was added to Soviet military thinking. It involved a variety of concepts, from air mobility in nuclear war to air transport support of deep offensive operations. Although the emphasis of Soviet military thought in the 60s was on nuclear war, the possibility of conventional conflict was not ignored. Throughout the 60s, paratroops dropped from Soviet transport aircraft were a feature of Soviet military exercises. In March 1970, in a military exercise called Dvina, 8,000 paratroops and 160 combat vehicles were unloaded in 22 minutes, most of them from AN-12 Cubs. The Cub has been used for a variety of tasks in addition to its straight cargo or troop-carrying role. This one is being used at the Zhukovsky Institute outside Moscow to test ejection seat systems. Less unusual variants of the Cub have included two different versions adapted for electronic intelligence, some in service with Soviet naval aviation. There's also an electronic countermeasures version designed to fly in orbit just inside Soviet borders. It carries equipment to jam the radars of NATO Hawk missile batteries. The adaptation to test ejection seats is one of the more unusual variations of the basic Cub. Although the AN-12 was a breakthrough for Soviet military transport, from a world point of view, it was not particularly significant. But the next Soviet military transport was. When it was introduced in 1965, it was the largest aircraft in existence. It came from the Antonov Bureau and was called the AN-22. NATO gave it the code name Cock, but its Soviet nickname was Antheus. The name was an unfortunate choice because in Greek mythology, the wrestler Antheus was invincible so long as he had one foot in contact with his mother, the Earth. Like its namesake, the Antonov AN-22 Antheus was more impressive when it remained in contact with the Earth than when it was in the air. The Antheus was designed to carry the largest of the Soviet fighting vehicles, including the T-62, T-72, and T-80 battle tanks and SAM missile launchers. Originally, there was great hope for its development as a military transport and as a civil airliner capable of carrying more than 700 passengers. A production run of about 30 aircraft a year was planned, but by the time production was halted in 1974, only 75 had been built. Like the AN-12 Cub, the AN-22 was in some ways crude. Pressurization was restricted to the flight deck and forward cabin, which could hold about 28 passengers. But it had enormous load capacity.